All right, it is exactly 1 o'clock. So I know we have some people who are still logging in. Welcome to those of you who have just joined us. We're going to start because we want to give as much time as possible to this really important conversation, knowing, of course, that we're gonna run short. My name is Matt Reichert. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at GIA Publications, and we're really glad that you've joined us. Many of you who are with us, as I see you signing in the attendee column here, have been with us for multiple sessions this week. So thanks for taking the time to participate in this summer series session. Glad to be joined by my colleague, Kate Williams, Senior Managing Editor at GIA. We're going to do things today just a little bit differently. So I want to give you the typical information at the beginning, how the session will go and how you'll participate. And then Kate will explain a little bit about how we are, or more precisely, are not going to participate in the facilitation for today's conversation. So really quickly, just to give as much time for the conversation, the chat feature, if you would use that, please, to say hello. If you have a comment, something like that you would like to add for the other participants, you can add the chat feature there. But if you have a question that you'd like the panelists to address, or you'd like to be incorporated into the discussion today, please use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. That helps us suss out and keep track of all of the questions you want us to talk about, as opposed to the comments that you'd like to make. So please use that. We want this to be as conversational as possible. This is a significant topic writ large for the church, but then of course we all have our own individual experiences we want to be able to bring into the conversation, so that Q&A feature is really important. We will record this. We are recording this conversation, and this will be made available for viewing likely later this evening. We want to get this conversation out there as soon as possible for people to rewatch and to share with your friends and colleagues. So please keep an eye out for that. It'll appear both on GIA's YouTube channel, where you can see all of our summer series sessions, and also on our Facebook page, and you'll get more details in our follow-up email. That follow-up email will also include links to more resources, the institutions and the associations and the projects that all of our panelists are a part of. More information will be in that follow-up email as well. I think I hit on everything. So before we go on, Kate, let's talk a little bit about how today will be a little different than our other summer series sessions.
Sure. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. And I think, Matt, it's been really important to both of us to be discerning where it's important for us to take the lead, and where it's important for us to tap into wisdom that is not ourselves. And part of that reason is that both of us are representatives of GIA, and GIA has been the main platform of David Haas. And that has been problematic, as we see. And though we're both new to GIA, we're still a part of GIA. And so we would like this conversation to not be led by GIA, but to be led by the wonderful panel gathered here, including the journalist Jamie Manson, who wrote the NCR article called "We Need to Talk About David Haas." So if you haven't seen that, I'm going to post it here in the chat for you, so you can have it at hand while you're listening and discerning what types of questions come to mind for you. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm really grateful for the three of you being willing to have a conversation, start one and begin one, and help us to keep it going in a way that is informed and compassionate and just. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kate. So with that, Kate and I, we're still going to be here. We're going to switch from panelist and moderator to participant. So all of the comments and all of the questions that you submit will still be visible to our panelists, but we're going to turn things over to Jenna, who will serve as moderator for today. And Kate and I are going to step into the background here. So Jenna, if you would say hello and introduce yourself, panelists, then you'll introduce yourself, and away we go. We'll see you at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt and Kate, for making this space for this really important conversation to happen. My name is Jena Thurow-Mountin. I'm a high school theology teacher and campus minister, most recently at an all-girls Catholic high school. I also write for various religious education and liturgy resources, namely for LTP and for the Liturgical Press in Collegeville. For the context of this conversation, I'll also just mention that I've been a liturgical musician since I had a great mentor at my parish in high school, and I've been an NPM member on and off for the last 8 years or so. With that, I'll ask Jamie and Zack to introduce yourselves. First Jamie, and then we'll move to Zack.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Manson. I write a column for the last 12 years in the National Catholic Reporter called Grace on the Margins. I relate to a lot of you. I have a Master of Divinity degree. I wanted to do church ministry more than anything. From when I was 14, I was profoundly moved by a Holy Thursday liturgy and never looked back. I worked in a parish. I was director of faith formation and pastoral associate. I ran RCIA, family faith. So I'm somewhat familiar with the work you do, even though I haven't been in ministry for over a decade. But it's really an honor to be with you, and I look forward to the conversation.
I'm Zack Stachowski. I am a parish music director and composer with GIA, and I'm a co-director of the One Call Institute and a co-host of the Open Your Hymnal podcast.
Great, thank you so much, Jamie and Zack, for those intros. And I think it'll be important for both of you to kind of, speak from your various experiences in ministry. I know, Zack, in particular, you wear a lot of different hats, so you're able to speak to working with youth, composing, kind of some different areas. Just to give some brief context for today's conversation, and then we'll just dive into it. So I think we need to begin by acknowledging that this conversation likely would not be happening if not for the women who stepped into a brave space, who came forward to shine a light on the manipulation, assault, and abuse perpetrated by David Haas. The Ministry of Into Account, SNAP, and other institutions that took their stories seriously and responded with transparency. I think these ministries lead the way for what we're going to be talking about today in terms of accountability and action. And just to say that this conversation, and I think I speak for the other panelists when I say this, today begins from a place of believing women, and specifically believing the 30 or so persons who have come forward to share stories about what David Haas has done. As Natalia noted in her session on Tuesday, for those of you who caught that session, this believing survivors is merely a first step, and we're hoping to kind of look towards next steps in this conversation. And finally, some of us are survivors of sexual assault. I'm sure some of those participating in the webinar today are. Many of us perhaps personally know someone who has experienced sexual violence. So I would just begin by inviting each of us to hold ourselves gently through what may be at times a difficult or challenging or uncomfortable conversation. And I'd encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, whether that's stepping away, watching parts of this later, digesting it, slowly, whatever you need to do, particularly if you are a survivor. So now to kind of frame our discussion, and then we'll get into it. We're going to kind of have 4 parts, and we hope to really integrate your questions throughout each part. We're going to begin by discussing why is this topic important? Why are we here talking about this today? Trying to diagnose the problems of structures, power, what led to the sexual abuse crisis in the church, in particular what we've been seeing in the last couple of years. Then we'll move from that kind of diagnosing stage to examining how can change happen, who's called to make change, and what does that change look like, and hopefully end on a note of hope, of envisioning what the church might look like and what structures might look like, programs for youth could look like if we make this change happen. So those 4 parts are kind of where we're traveling today. let's begin, I think, with you, Jamie. As Kate mentioned, you recently published a piece with the National Catholic Reporter entitled "We Need to Talk About David Haas." Again, that link is in the chat for those of you who want to reference it. So that seems like a fitting place to begin. I'm going to ask some broad questions and you can just take it from there, Jamie. Why do we need to talk about this? Maybe who needs to talk about this? And what do you kind of observe as the problem behind David Haas, Jean Vanier, other cases of sexual assault in the church?
Well, I think for me, what really drove home the core, what I believe is the core essential problem, is when I went to Rome in February of 2019, Pope Francis called this unprecedented meeting, a summit of every bishop in the world to come to Rome to talk about the sex abuse crisis. And I was there, went to every press conference, you know, and what struck me so much about that meeting was that it was about listening to survivors, though no survivors, just maybe one or two were actually invited in the room to speak to the bishops. It was about policies and procedures. No one talked about sex. No one talked about sexuality. No one talked about the taboo morality that really governs the church's sexual ethic. No one talked about gender, certainly. And I said, my goodness, how are you going to get to the root of these problems if none of this even is spoken of as a possible issue or one of the roots of the problem? What became the rallying cry after that meeting was clericalism. The problem is clericalism. The problem is there are some priests who think they're above the law, essentially. They think they're on pedestals. They think they're special. And that became the rallying cry. And at the end of that summit, Pope Francis gave what should have been the most important speech of his life, really. And it ended up being a very strange speech, where he said, basically, here's a quote. He said, "Consecrated persons chosen by God to guide souls to salvation let themselves be dominated by their human frailty or sickness and thus become tools of Satan." So he saw it in these very metaphysical terms, you know, of it was this cosmic battle, you know, and that somehow, you know, the devil was trying to destroy the church. And, you know, it ended up being this very melodramatic avoidance, I think, of some really deep truths that needed to come out of that meeting. So it was a very important thing for me to attend because I saw how much the church is avoiding. And because, you know, we live in a hierarchical church, if the clergy are avoiding it, it's not going to be spoken of, you know, inside the walls of the church. And so this really, really colored my perception of what was going on. And it made me think back to when I was in ministry and I was doing safe environment training and you know, I had to do it myself. I had to offer it to my catechists. And I just recall that training also just never even got near the root of the issues. It felt like safe environment training was meant to cover the church's back. That it didn't get to systemic issues. It was sort of, all right, the church is facing an existential threat. We got to do what we got to do with these policies to make sure that doesn't happen. So it doesn't get to, again, the root cause of what's going on. What do I think is the root cause? I think one thing that no one really talks about, I think the issue isn't so much clericalism, but what really is the root of clericalism, which is that we live in a patriarchal church. Most of society is patriarchal around the globe. The United States is still a patriarchal society, but the United States, the Catholic Church takes it to the next level because our leadership is only men. And not only are they men, they are all ostensibly celibate men, meaning that women literally have no influence, even as wives, over the leaders of the church. And so what I find really important and helpful about stories like David Haas, stories like Jean Vanier, who founded l'Arche, the l'Arche community, that it was discovered, it was revealed in January that he had these very ritualistic, cultish sexual relationships with adult women. Why those stories are important is it shows us that this goes beyond clericalism. You know, David Haas, Jean Vanier were not ordained, but they enjoyed a certain status of spiritual father or spiritual hero in which they benefited from the patriarchy of the Catholic Church. What is patriarchy? Okay, we hear it's become a rallying cry of its own, smash the patriarchy. It's become, there's many gifts for smash the patriarchy, but you know, because we hear it so much, it has lost really what its meaning. I want to define what patriarchy is for everybody, because I know the word raises hackles, like feminism raises hackles, like Me Too does. Patriarchy does too. So let's just get a definition of what that is. Patriarchy is any system in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. In a patriarchal structure, powerful men dominate women, children, and also other vulnerable men. That's a really important part of patriarchy that a lot of people don't recognize. Men are also victims of patriarchy. So when I think about, you know, as a journalist dealing with the Catholic Church, from a somewhat cut, the National Catholic Reporter is known for doing investigative journalism and trying not to flinch from hard issues. When I'm just constantly hearing about sex abuse cases. So when I hear about, not only children being abused by priests, but adult women being abused by priests, or bishops raping nuns, or Cardinal McCarrick forcing seminarians, gay and straight, into sexual relationships. What is the common denominator there? The common denominator is this patriarchal belief that this very special class of men are entitled to use the bodies of women, children, and vulnerable men for their sexual gratification. That's really what is at the root of that. Now, people will argue with me and say, well, nuns are abusive too. Yes, that's absolutely true. You know, nuns are working out of a very patriarchal mindset. Also, this is the model of leadership that they've inherited. This is the abuse. They are modeling an abuse of power in similar ways. But because the Catholic Church has this very small elite class of men having literally all the power, every teaching we have in the Catholic Church is developed by them. All the enforcement is enforced by them. It's really a very radical thing that we have. And I think it is the root of so much abuse that we see in the church. When the Harvey Weinstein issue broke out, I was reflecting. I wrote a piece that I gave the crew, I gave Matt the link to this piece I wrote about Hollywood and the Vatican and the similarities. And I was thinking for this talk about Weinstein, and I was struck by something given this audience. In Hollywood and in the media, there is an elite ruling class of wealthy men also who were kingmakers. Harvey Weinstein was one of them. But music ministry is an interesting thing because you have the church aspect and you have the entertainment aspect. So you almost have like a double jeopardy in terms of having these cult of personalities, having these idols, and having these kingmakers. So it's a very interesting situation, I think, that music ministry is in that way. These kingmakers, these powerful men decide who becomes famous, whose voices will be influential, whose name will be known, and whose name will not be known. The patriarchal system gives them license to abuse their power through sexual coercion and domination, particularly of women and of children. Now, the Catholic Church did not invent patriarchy, but it has sanctified it. It has made it into a holy system. How has it done that? Because we have this, and Natalia, if you haven't watched her talk, she did a really brilliant job of explaining it. We have this theology of gender complementarity. So what Catholic doctrine says, and not just Catholic doctrine, evangelicals say this too, Mormons say this too. We have this idea that God created men and created women in very specific ways with different anatomies as a way to communicate to human beings what men's roles in society and church will be and what women's roles in society and church will be. So when you listen to Pope Francis, who says some really interesting things about equal pay for women and things like that, he always says men and women are equal in dignity. He always qualifies it that way. He never says men and women are equal. He can't, because he too believes in gender complementarity. So it's this idea that God created men to lead, to take initiative, and God created women to serve and to receive. So when you have that kind of system, you know, that says, well, this is God's plan for humanity, that men have these roles and women have these roles. And if you go against that system, you are going against God. You're going against nature as God created it. That's pretty heavy. You know, that's what you're being told, that this is what God, this is God's plan for humanity. That's why, by the way, we don't have women priests in the Catholic Church, because of this gender complementarity. You know, the church actually will say it's unnatural for a woman to want to be a priest. She wants to be a man. She's going against God's plan for humanity. So this is sort of the anthropology that we're working out of in our theology. I want to talk a little bit about why people abuse specifically, and why the patriarchal system has this impact it does. In the church, in entertainment, the majority of victims were women and children. There are untold cases of sexual assault and propriety, but where does it come from? There was a really good article that I used this in my piece about Hollywood and the Vatican. There was a doctor, Alexandra Kathakis. She's got a Greek name. I hope I'm saying it right. She wrote a piece called The Power of Praying, Preying. And she explained why men target women in the workplace. She could have easily been writing about priests, but she could have easily been writing about situations like Jean Vanier and David Haas. She says, these men have ample opportunity to groom the innocent by garnering their trust and seducing them with false promises. They bank on the likelihood that their victims' terror of exposure will keep them from exposing their perpetrator. From what my understanding is, there was a lot of that dynamic in the David Haas situation, where women were trying to say what was happening. Either they weren't believed or people tried to advocate for them. There was this hush hush, don't expose him. There was a great fear about victimizing David Haas. She explains in this article why so many victims remain silent. She says, when the predator finally strikes, the victim becomes disoriented. A trusted, admired person has violated her. These sexual acts happen swiftly, sending the victim into a haze of confusion or freezing her ability to move or determine what's okay and what's not okay in that moment. So I think that's why so many women don't come forward. Part of it is that it's the shock. It's intended to be shocking. It's intended to be disorienting, but also in the gender complementarity system, because men have all the power and they cover for each other, women are not trusted. Women's stories are not trusted. Women have no power in that system. So why these men act out is interesting. I would invite you, if you haven't listened, to a podcast called Deliver Us. It was done by my friend Maggie Van Dorn for America Media, America Magazine. Amazing, amazing thing just about the sex abuse crisis. And in episode 2, she talks to Dr. Thomas Plant about what generates, what makes these men abuse. It turns out even most priest abusers are not actually, cannot be classified as real, pedophiles. Like, they don't fit every classification. Plant says that many of them they have comorbidities of depression, of anxiety, of addiction. They have these profound forms, these profound self-hatreds that come out of deep shame. And so these acting out in a sexually assaultive way is almost a form of hatred. It's an act of hatred. We know that, rape is never not about sex and, sexual desire. It's about the desire to dominate, the desire to humiliate. So that's sort of what is generating a lot of these men, whether they're priests, whether they're just spiritual, powerful people. That's so often what is the driving force behind this assault. This shame-based personality manifests itself in shame-based sexuality. When a male in power acts out sexually, he's regulating long-buried rage by acting it out in a sexually assaultive way. So I think that's really important to understand too. That's why this is not just a problem in the clergy. So we've got our theology, a theological situation that supports it. We also, because of gender complementarity, Catholics have this very unfortunate, no matter how progressive they are, they fall into this pattern of hero worship. Why? Because it was communicated to us all of our lives that men are exceptional, that only men are allowed to be priests, that they're a special class of men. And so people like Vanier and Haas, again, benefit from that, because we tend to want to make heroes, and they're almost always men. And so when you're fed that notion that only God wants men to be leaders and that men are exceptional, you get the breeding ground for this to happen. I want to wrap up because I've been going on too long. I think that what do we need to remedy the situation are several things, and I can talk more about it in the Q&A. One of them is we need a new sexual ethic, and one that is rooted in justice and in the norms of justice. My professor, Margaret Farley, wrote an amazing book in 2008 that was condemned by the Vatican, by the way, about using the norms of justice to discern what are good and just sexual relationships and what are unjust sexual relationships. And she has a whole framework about it, which I can say more about if folks want to hear. So we need that. We also need to make the changes that our leaders won't. And I think that's what I'm seeing in this GIA event. When I was in Rome, one of the most powerful things I did was I walked with a bunch of sexual abuse victim survivors in the streets of Rome. There were hundreds of them. And the Vatican would not let them in. And they were so angry and they were so wounded. And I marched with them and I covered the whole thing on Twitter. But what moved me so much is I said, this is the hope. This is the hope of the church. And you are the hope of the church by taking this on so bravely. This is a moment to really let your voices and your leadership stand out. I love the boomer generation because they're my #1 fan club, and they've been very good to me. But I think there's a tendency to want to keep hearing the same heroes of a certain generation, particularly heroic men. They get invited to do all the talks. We play their music over and over again. This is a real moment for a new generation of composers to have their music heard, to hear non-white people's music, to hear so many things. So I think that you are the hope of this moment. And what you're doing in this programming is a sign of that. You're being prophets. And so even though I know it's bleak and I know it's sad and I know it's wounding, I want you to rest in the fact that you are the church's hope right now. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie, for I think you gave us a lot to break open today and hopefully in the weeks to come about kind of the roots of some of these issues. I want to touch on a few things that you just mentioned and then hear a little bit from Zack. So I think some of the main things I just heard you talk about was, first of all, the role of silence that you named in your visit to the Vatican, right? And that silence reinforces this culture of shame that not only damages survivors, not only damages women, but also damages the growth of ministers, of priests, of the whole body of Christ to be able to thrive in healthy and mutual relationship with one another. I think that's something that's really important. And just to name that, yeah, I'm excited that we're having this conversation, that we're kind of breaking some of that silence and shame that's surrounded topics of sexuality for so long. Another thing that I heard you name from your experience as a minister was that safe environment policies are often just kind of boxes to check and can be ineffective ineffective. And I know one of the reasons why today's session is named Beyond Safe Environment is because some women who came forward with stories about David Haas, safe environment, which kind of went up until they were 18, safe environment didn't really work when they were youth, and then certainly failed them when they became adults according to the law.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and bear in mind, and Natalia brought this up, that, you know,
Mhm.
the reports are Haas was knew their 18th birthdays, you know,
Yes.
which is so he had them marked already, you know. And
Mhm.
again, I think you have a situation where, you know, the abusers know, can sense who's vulnerable, you know, and how
Mhm.
sadly how to exploit that. And those, again, these are topics that don't come up in safe environment, you know.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'm grateful to hear you kind of name the tension in this liturgical music world of kingmakers or hero worship, because that's something that I feel that I've personally observed, having attended some NPM conventions. You know, I've seen that at NPM, at LA Congress. You know, anytime you put someone on a stage, or you give them a microphone, right? Or there's an autograph line to get books signed from them. Like, we see this across many different fields, but it just seems, it seems so strange, particularly in the field of ministry and theology, to kind of play into mirroring the secular world that we see as well.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I think one thing I struggle at with LA Congress, I never get invited to speak there. Uh, so what I mean by that is, because of who I am, because I'm an unabashed advocate for women's ordination to the priesthood. I'm very public about that, which is still an excommunicable offense in this church. And also I'm openly lesbian, and I'm partnered, and I'm very proud about that. I've been out for 12 years in my column, you know, and then so I don't get invited. And then you hear Congress, and I see the liturgies, and they're gorgeous liturgies, and they're talking about justice, and, you know, throwing down the mighty and Magnificat and all this. And then I'm like, but who's on the stage? You have all men in power. There are no
mhm,
women with any power. So how are you singing to me about justice? You know, because there are a lot of people who are not, their voices are not allowed at Congress, you know, and that's
mhm,
injustice. And then you've got this whole power structure up there on the stage in this beautiful justice-oriented liturgy. And you have the structure of terrible, you know, power imbalance.
mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder, because I often think of LA Congress as the big tent of Catholicism.
Right,
Like,
right.
there's the whole spectrum represented, but there are voices on the margin who are being left out. And, you know, perhaps people, because they've spoken up um, for justice, for those who are marginalized, maybe we're not hearing their voices.
Yeah, so it's just
Yeah,
something. I'm not by far not the only one. There are people being
sure.
left out because of race, because of abuse status,
Hmm.
because all of that stuff, you know, but it's something to
Yeah.
look at.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think
Sure.
that opened up a lot for us. I'd like to hear from you, Zack, a little bit about, I said before that you wear a lot of different hats. Can you speak to kind of this part of the problem in terms of the celebrity sort of culture in liturgical music at these sorts of conferences, and whether you want to speak kind of from your composer lens, and then maybe if you can bring us into your kind of youth ministry lens, directing one call, or maybe even from your own experience of MMA. What do you perceive as some of the problems here? Any stories that you would share?
Well, I want to thank Jamie and Natalia for providing us this framework, this like meta framework of the theology, of the systems, this analysis of the church that has brought us here in more areas than just liturgical music ministry. And Jenna, I thank you for raising the question early on when all of the news about David broke about celebrity culture. I think you were among the first, if not the first, to step in and raise that really challenging question. I think it's really interesting when we look back. So, right after Vatican II, a lot of the music that came out and started getting used and published and recorded was of the folk genre, right? Which aligned with what was the popular music of the time in the secular world as well. And so what did that lead to? We started promoting liturgical music the same way that record labels do, right? This is where we took our cues from. If you look back, all of the early album covers of like the Damians, the St. Louis Jesuits, all, great friends of mine, but they look like Peter, Paul and Mary records and stuff. So we were already taking the playbook of popular early on and applying it to liturgical music. And it really hasn't changed. If anything, it has become worse. So instead of being sheet music publishers now, the publishers are like brand managers of artists, in addition to publishing sheet music, right? So we're already building celebrity as the main marketing tool, right? And so you look at catalogs from all the different publishers, their websites, they're mostly organized by people, right? And then the conventions, of course, then end up also marketing by people rather than content, for instance, right? So all of a sudden now we're walking into conventions, LA Congress and PM, and others. Don't mean to just pinpoint that, but I know looking at our participant list that a lot of people are familiar with those. You walk into the exhibit hall, like you said, we have lines for autographs, we have huge posters and billboards with people's faces and things. And so we've exploded then this this framework of celebrity, and we've then bestowed immense amounts of spiritual power in these people, right? That's also then rooted the patriarchal power that Jamie and Natalia have been talking about, right? That, and then compounded with the fact that the people who are attending these things have been taught in many cases from a very early age that this is our faith, right? That kind of hero worship, the belief in the patriarchal systems is our faith, and it's a sin to not comply with it, right? So that's why, especially I think within this particular area of the Catholic Church and liturgical music, when you have both of those factors at play, it becomes a uniquely dangerous place, right? Because like when you go to a rock concert, I think in some ways you go with your eyes more widely open because no one is making any pretenses that this is a safe place in the way that we say that church is a safe place. I shared with the group in our pre-conversation that, in my younger, more rebellious years, when I wanted to go to a party or something, I said I was going to church youth group because we just assumed that was the okay place to go, and my parents were fine with it. But now, in light of these discussions and the revelations that we're finding, and I guess we shouldn't say revelations because let's be serious, this has been going on since the dawn of the church, right? Like, and we've known, right? So perhaps it's just a time now where we're having better conversations about it, maybe, hopefully. But I think our commitment toward safe environment, whatever that might be, has to be broadened, and it has to start with recognizing that no, this space is a uniquely dangerous environment right now. I think we have to start there, and I think these conversations are moving us to that place. And our policies and whatever reforms and conversations we have now have to move us to a place where it's not just about the top-down reform of instituting policies and training sessions, but also that empower and encourage systems for people to report instances, to feel safe in doing that, to know that they're going to be believed when they come forward, to have the support of others who know. That's why we think it's so important for, in this specific instance, like colleagues of David Haas to speak out, because it helps to amplify and to create the space where we can move forward. And so I hope that we're moving toward a place where, when we're now redesigning and reforming whatever our safe environment, for lack of a better word, policies are going to be, that they require a more active approach to identifying these problems, sussing them out, and hopefully solving them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what I hear in both your reflections, Zach, and Jamie's, is that it's not just about adding safe environment guidelines, but rather, and I think Margaret Farley talks about this in her work, really transforming the culture and transforming kind of the basic values of how we interact with one another, particularly in a Christian context, in an embodied context as well. I want to catch some comments and questions that have been going on in the chat. So let's see, Ken Morrison, I think asked a great question. So if we're recognizing that there's a problem of this celebrity culture in liturgical music, but also in other fields, right? In publishing, we could look at almost every single field and see this. If we recognize that, how do you know if you are perhaps buying into that or contributing to that culture, right? So like, I can think of an example when I was a young college student where I asked Tony Alonso for an autograph because I love his liturgical music. I don't know if Tony is on here, but right. And I look back on that and I kind of cringe, and I also see where I bought into this culture of, oh, I bought a CD and I got the composer to sign it, right? But so where's the kind of natural appreciation for people's gifts and experiences and the way that the Spirit is working through them for the good of the church? Where's the line between that and this hero worship or king making, that, as Jamie called it? This is for either of you.
I think it's important to first identify that distinction, that celebrity culture is uniquely dangerous in the area of like the spiritual area, right? Like, so that's I think an important distinction. But also, celebrity culture is not always in and of itself the dangerous thing, right? It's when the systems are in place that kind of power can be wielded to inflict harm on people, right? So like when we have this system that's so rooted in patriarchy, and with people who are just inherently vulnerable because of their beliefs, the ways that they were taught about sex being shameful, and the church's teaching about gender and roles and clericalism, and then you put celebrity culture into that. Now, I think Ken's point, it's a difficult one to discern, right? Because yeah, there are, like, how do we then decide, like, we're going to publish music, and then music is going to be written by people, right? And people are going to speak and give keynotes at conventions. I think what I'd like to see for conventions and things like that is more of a move toward content-driven marketing, product-driven marketing about these things, so that it's not about, oh, I'm going to NPM to see such and such person. I'm going to LA Congress because I want to have a conversation about this, and I want to be about that. I think that could be maybe one of the first steps. I think it's just a subtle, like, philosophical shift there.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Zach. Thanks. I think that clarifies it a little bit for me. Jamie, anything to add?
Super quick, because I want to get more questions in. I
Yeah.
think the most important thing is recognizing power imbalances. You know, where you have, sometimes you don't have equal relationships, and you have to recognize that. And that when that's the case, you're not going to be able to have a just relationship. Teacher student, or priest and pastor and congregant. Even celebrity and devotee, to just recognizing that sexual relationships are not ever going to be just when there's an inequality of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And that power in the Catholic Church has often taken the form of power over sort of domination, hierarchical, rather than like, I think, Zach, when you were talking, I was thinking about, well, how do we get to affirming someone's gifts, but also recognizing that that doesn't mean that I don't have gifts to share as well, right? That doesn't mean that this person, I need to put them on a pedestal, but rather that they have gifts and I have gifts, and we can celebrate those and build one another up and empower one another in a healthy way.
Right. I think, I'm trying to make a distinction between when are we engaging in this music or with these people in an entertainment venue versus a formational one, right? Because at our conventions, the specific ones that we go to, that line is blurred everywhere. There's no distinction, right? And then I think, and I want to commend Kate and Matt for being willing to actually not be a part of this conversation as representatives of GIA, because I'll say, if there's one thing that the publishers have been complicit in, it's in this kind of consolidation of power into a small amount of people, mostly men, right? Because there's only so many songs or recordings that can get made in a year, right? Because especially when it's person dominated, right? So like, let's say that a publishing house publishes like 100 songs. I know it's more than that in a year, but they have like 4 people, usually men, who make recording collections that year, right? So that's 4 by like 12 songs, right? So that's almost half the songs already in a given year that are going to be written that take up the quota, right? Because they're working in the record label model of making albums, right? Instead of just sheet music, right? And so then all of a sudden, subconsciously or consciously, it actually becomes in their financial interest to have fewer artists to promote, because you can do it. It costs more to promote more artists. And so then that consolidates the power. And so why we see the same keynote speakers at all the conventions all the time, and the same people making records and being invited everywhere. So there has to be a destabilization or a decentralization of that too, I think.
Yeah, thanks for naming that just really in a spot on way, Zach. I think I don't have much experience with the kind of composing publisher industry, but I kind of can see that as a problem in the way that you're naming it. We had some other people, this was a little bit earlier, but they just made some comments to clarify that, yeah, this isn't just a problem in the liturgical music industry, but you can go to LA Congress and see long lines to get books signed by Bishop Barron or Father James Martin, right? Catholic speakers who make their living, basically on presentations and writing books and things, kind of making their name. I think that we can also see this at the parish and school level as well, so that if a youth minister seems great and irreplaceable, right, or if a theology teacher facilitates kind of the student's relationship with God in a way that they're in a very privileged position of responsibility and spiritual care for the people, you know, who they minister with. So yeah, Bex just shared in the chat, yeah, it all seems to come back to power. It all seems to come back to power. With this kind of broader lens, I want to move us into kind of how can change happen, or what should change look like? And this might get to the accountability question. So what is the role of publishers or organizations like NPM, parishes, schools, all of us as church? What is our responsibility, and how might we attack these unhealthy, damaging structures from wherever we are planted? Jamie, let's start with you.
Oh, I don't know. I think first of all, believe the survivors. That would be, you know, and it doesn't mean, you know, everyone, you know, it just means, you know, listen to their stories and believe them. You know, remember that they're coming from a very vulnerable place when they come forward. You know, take action. Things like that. That would be the first part. It's tricky because, you know, if you're working in a Catholic church, particularly, you are working in an unjust structure, and there's only just so much you can do about that. But I think that, you know, different organizations like GIA, you can, you know, move forward. You know, where you have that kind of power to make change, then you take advantage of that power. And I think, you know, just I would encourage people to read more deeply about ethics and power and sexual power. I highly recommend. Mara Farley's book is a little tricky to read because it's pretty academic, but she has some basic frameworks about how to relate. You know, just, you know, what are just relationships? You know, what are the qualities? Respecting someone's vulnerability, having mutuality. Free consent. I mean, just very basic things to be more educated about. I mean, the Catholic Church, the sexual ethic of the Catholic Church is very limited. It's taboo and shame-based. But there are some wonderful theologians, Catholics, particularly in the Catholic Church, gives birth to all these wonderful feminist theologians and, you know, and sexual ethicists and things like that. So the resources are out there, you know.
Yeah. And this kind of brings us to a question that Brenda asked, and I know, you know, many others have kind of been asking these questions. For those of us in church or school ministry who, you know, maybe believe, well, talking about these issues, breaking the silence is an initial first step, right? Listening to survivors' stories and then having these kinds of conversations. So how might someone bring this conversation to their parish or their pastor or their school? Like whether it's specifically about David Haas, you know, sharing these stories of women, because it seems to have just kind of rested in the liturgical music world right now. Many aren't aware of it. Where might you start with these conversations?
I don't know if Zach has any idea of it. I know it's a struggle in Catholic settings, you know, where you can't talk about gender equality. You know, they've set up the system so you can't have these conversations. You know, that's where you get excommunicated if you talk about women's ordination. You know, so there's a reason for that's silencing. You know, so it's very, very tricky. I wish I had better ideas. That you have a lot more in colleges. You have a lot, you know, you have more academic freedom and things like that. But I think high school is an especially challenging arena. If it's a Catholic high school. I don't know if Zach has any insight.
Right. So like, let's say a Catholic high school decides not to use David Haas's music any longer. I know the high school that I just taught at, that's like 80% of the music that we would ever sing. So do you have a conversation with students, with administrators, you know, how do you?
Yeah, I think you do, you know,
Right.
like I said in my article, don't just cancel him, you know, explain why, let this be an opportunity to have a conversation, you know, because these dynamics are gonna continue. And especially if you're at a young women's college, you know, they're gonna encounter these situations. There should never be, you know, a ban on speaking about sexualized violence, you know, and the structures that create that. But I think it can be a very good entry point, this is why we are no longer using his music.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm curious, Jenna, like having worked in an all-girls high school, like how you would maybe approach that conversation.
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely a difficult one to have. I think it would be necessary to talk to the students about this, particularly that these are some of their favorite and the most well-known hymns, right? These are the words, this is the music that we use to pray together as a school community. So I think it would just need to be, I don't even entirely know where I imagine this happening. Like in the theology classrooms, maybe, at an all-school sort of assembly or prayer service, maybe even for a service for survivors of sexual violence, and then maybe during a time of reflection, just naming this and lamenting that we're no longer going to be praying with this music, but what does this mean for our community, and what does it mean to stand with survivors? Yeah, I would maybe start there, but I would just want to acknowledge, like, a lot of people have these concerns, and it's not an easy answer by any means.
Yeah, it strikes me like just how complete it is to have
Mm-hmm.
any sort of approach to safe environment training that isn't inclusive of the entire community. Like we have this really like top-down approach, thinking that we're going to fix or prevent the abusers, right? And it would seem that a lot of this also needs to be shared and talked about among the people who we would see who could be potential victims in these cases too, to show them
Mm-hmm.
these are the, like how to recognize it. I know if anyone has seen just a lot of my own Facebook posts in response to the David Haas situation is just, I did not experience anything in terms of like sexual assault, but when we started to really talk about just the patterns of grooming behavior and
Mm-hmm.
just an abusive relationship in general, I identified a lot of that in my own relationship with David. I think probably a lot of people in the room know that my working relationship with David had been very close for the last 20 years. And I didn't see it at the time. And a lot of us now in our conversations are like, it would have been helpful at some point. And I don't think I ever had this training to say, like, if you notice this from a mentor or a teacher, this is something, to be reported or to be thought about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Zach, because I know you composed and worked with David in a number of ways over the last years. We have a lot of questions pouring in, and I want to get to as many of these as we can, but I do want to say that we're nearing the hour mark. So for any of those listening, watching along, if you need to leave, this video will be posted, I think Matt said, hopefully later tonight, so that you can continue to watch if you need to run to a meeting. But Jamie and Zach, are you okay chatting for another maybe 15, 20 minutes? We'll see. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So just to hear a couple of questions from participants, Bex Gaunt asked a great question. In an age of influencers and personal brands, it's difficult to picture a liturgical culture that doesn't idolize celebrities. That's what sells. So what motivation would there be for publishers to move away from this culture?
I've been really curious about how true that is, because I tend to think we think of LA Congress, NPM, the conventions, as indicative of the entire like world,
Hmm.
but it's important to remember, I think, that the people who go to those, especially the people who like aren't actually like liturgical music directors or things like that, are the super fans. Like it's their Comic-Con, right? Like, I mean, Comic-Con is not indicative of the way that people like that the aggregate of people consume movies and like that. Those are the super fans, right? So I think that there is room that like if you move toward content-based marketing, topic-based things, I don't know that there are so many people out there who know so much about the individual people that it would make so much of a difference. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe that's how everyone in the pew is trying to decide what book they're going to buy about whatever. But like, I think of like the liturgical press, like the Living Liturgy, and the other planning books, like from LTP. We don't often, I think, know who wrote those books. But because the content is marketed in such a way as such a valuable tool to us, we buy them anyways, right? And maybe we buy them because we know that such and such person was an author this year, but they also change the authors every year, right? So I think maybe that there's something there that shows us a path forward in this way, away from the the celebrity culture model.
Yeah, so here's an interesting question, maybe of clarification. Like, is it on the publishers then to kind of help us as consumers of this music, to help us maybe break the mold of, well, I love all music by this composer. Yeah, like where is the kind of responsibility for that? I hear that a little bit in what you shared, Zach, with the content-based.
Yeah, I think it probably does start with the publishers and with the conventions, right? Because they are the kingmakers right now. They create that. I don't know. We haven't seen, at least I haven't seen, anyone really break through in any sort of meaningful way, or like really like big way, without going down those traditional avenues yet. Like there doesn't seem to be an alternative to it yet. So since they seem to be the gatekeepers, it probably does start there.
Right. Yeah, a couple of folks added in on the chat. Beck said it's also on the hosts of conferences. Kate Williams shared that the results of a recent NPM survey suggested that the majority of people get their primary formation from publishers, right? So she, as a member of GIA, feels the weight of that responsibility.
I should say I can't absolve myself from this as a host of the Open Your Hymnal podcast, which has bought in, used, and benefited from the celebrity culture. And if you like, in our recent post, Matt and I are trying to figure out how to move away from that, what the path forward is, and now what the Open Your Hymnal platform can do to be allies in these conversations. But I am mindful of that. It's a tough situation.
Right.
Yeah, I think, as someone who is, I'm completely on my own, I'm a contract worker. I have to keep promoting myself or I go under financially. So it's a tricky thing, but I think what I try to do is think that, to me, this obsession with celebrity is a real spirit sickness, I think, that comes out of a profound loneliness in our culture. There's a profound desire to be known, I think, and to be seen. And I think that comes out of just a complete lack of presence. in our culture. And it's sad, because things get worse, I feel, every day with the influencers and all this stuff. And, they're like these idols for us, these golden calves that distract us, in some ways from what's really meaningful in life. But again, that it comes out of deep, deep loneliness, I think, and a loss of intimacy, I think, in our culture. So I've always tried to, name that, of what's fueling that, and try to, I have to self-promote. I hate it, but try to do it in a way that's present. You know what I mean? That somehow exhibits presence, because I think that's what people are very hungry for.
Right, and that takes discernment on its own for each, individual to discern that, for publishing houses to discern that, and PM to discern that, while listening to the voices of their members. Yeah. Let's see, we have a few more questions. This is an interesting one. Michael Jonkis asked, in addition to dismantling patriarchy and creating a new sexual ethic, which I think, Jamie, you named, must or should we also dismantle late capitalism, which seems to be a root of celebrity culture? So where might you see those intersecting? Or
yeah, I think it's a product of radical individualism. I really do. And what makes me sad is that one of the things I still love about being Catholic, even though the church would love me to get out as soon as possible, one of the reasons I keep calling myself Catholic is because we are a communal faith. We do believe, that God dwells here and the now in creation in every one of us. We have this very sacramental understanding of people, of the world, of all of creation. And capitalism has absolutely no regard for that. What's interesting about patriarchy is that in addition to the domination of women, children, vulnerable men, it's also a domination of nature, and I think we see that in late capitalism, that we just completely use the earth, for our own, very, disproportionate needs for things. So I think that's absolutely right on target. Yeah, and again, we have the resources in the Catholic tradition for it. We're not evangelicals. It's not about me and my personal relationship with my Lord and Savior. We are really a communal faith. And that's for me the irony of this whole thing about women. Men have this role, women have this role. Well, we as Catholics, we believe God is everywhere. One of the things I love about the Catholic tradition, God is everywhere. And yet you have a hierarchy, a small group of elite men saying where God can and cannot be all the time. So I think we have to get back to the roots of the Catholic tradition, of our sacramental view of the world too, which could be a very renewing force for all of these structures.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Catholic social teaching, right, can provide us some guidance on how to operate in this culture and in this world.
Right. But without our sacramental view of the world, there is no social justice teaching. It really is rooted in our sense of all things in creation being good, and that God is revealed in them, So good connection.
And I think, if there's anything that Jesus consistently reveals to us in the Gospels, it's a blueprint to moving away from capitalism. It's a rejection of all that that system exalts, So I guess, I'll get chased out of the church pretty soon too. But I think that's what's going on there.
Yeah. Well, we need to hang on to you guys. We need your voices.
I'm hanging in.
Yes. I think in these last 5 or 10 minutes or so, let's bring this conversation forward to imagine what if we're able to transform this patriarchal, capitalist, celebrity culture that's taken root in our church, right, through small steps, through the publishers working, through conventions, discerning in good faith, through individuals and conversations to kind of change this culture. What do you imagine this church might look like? What would you imagine, maybe Zack, as a co-facilitator of One Call, how do you imagine a liturgical music camp looking maybe different? And are there any models of this that you might suggest our listeners look to?
Well, I think a model of inclusion would be really, really a good start. I referenced this briefly at the end of my formal comments, but you know, about the boomers, who are my number one support system in terms of my readership. But you know, at conferences and things like that, they seem to want to hear from the same old folks. Very often, I'm the exception to the rule. I'm not a millennial. I'm really Gen X that gets in. But I think that, you know, we're in this very fascinating moment, revolution, I think, of inclusion. And I think that we just have to start playing the music, you know, of young people, and we have to start playing the music of people of color, and just incorporating it into liturgy, and sort of slay the old idols. You know, I mean, some of the music is wonderful and is very important to my own spirituality. But we have to really, really broaden, you know, what we're listening to. We need to give access to people who have had no access because of our idolizations. Just really opening up and being more inclusive of new voices, young voices, voices of color is a really important first step, I think.
Absolutely.
I think we have this amazing gift in the fact that so many people in this trade will gather at yearly convention conferences, and yet, like Jamie was saying, we feed them the same people over and over again. In many cases, we feed the same topics over and over again. And in an effort to not alienate anyone, because we realize that the tent is big and we all have different facets of Catholicism in our faith that we're all trying to serve and we're all trying to give we're all trying to validate. When issues like this confront us, we still retreat to a position of not wanting to make anyone mad. So then no one is saying this is right and this is wrong, which means then we're in a position where we can't actually have any sort of gathering or conversation that moves us forward. And that's where I want to commend GIA here, because I feel like they have drawn a line to say, we believe this, this, and this. We're going to provide formation that hopefully moves us toward a place where we can start to problem solve about those things. I hope that we'll see a world where our other national conventions and publishing houses and everything else starts to make similar efforts about things that are supported in gospel teaching, that that we own that. And I think, you know, what Ken is asking here about, you know, what are the concrete plans? I think, you know, that paints it as a pretty black and white framework, right? It's more nuanced than that. Of course, like, you can advertise speakers, but if it's done within a framework that we've like done the hard work of creating good environments, safe environments for people, we can do that. I think as far as capitalism, I think a lot of the publishing houses within this sphere might consider what moving to a nonprofit structure versus for-profit might do in terms of how their company operates and works within these frameworks. I think having composers and authors have to go through a blind submission process, no matter how much money that they've made for the company, might be helpful. I say these things without actually having thought them through. So they might be ridiculous, but that comes to mind, right? Like, about what a world would look like that is content and topic driven versus person driven. And I think those could be things worth having a conversation about in terms of concrete steps.
Right. Yeah, and I want to name too that earlier this week, I know GA announced that they've established a code of conduct for their composers and authors, and are working with the Association of Catholic Publishers to develop kind of a shared code of conduct across publishing. and myself, and then I saw some other commenters on social media where we were like surprised that these codes of conduct didn't exist or were minimal, perhaps. So like recognizing the gaps that are present, like we named in safe environment, the need to go beyond safe environment, right, to really changing our culture. I think these are all good things to kind of start us working on and to keep in mind. Kate said, even more surprising is the pushback we've gotten for instating a code of conduct. Oh my. Well, thank you so much. I think a good place to kind of wrap up our conversation is the call that Jamie and Zack presented to us to remain courageous, right? And that these are going to be difficult conversations, but necessary for change and growth and transformation in our church and our communities. And we can be a support network for one another, committed to these conversations. Any final words, Jamie and Zack?
Thank you, Jenna, for moving us through and for, just being an important voice in the conversation yourself.
Yeah, I always like to, when you talk about courage, I like to use something Sister Teresa Kane says. She's the one that in 1980 said hello to Pope John Paul II. The world was watching and invited him to ordain women priests. So she knows a little bit about courage. And she says, courage means a rage within one's heart. And that's what I saw in the streets of Rome with those survivors of sex abuse. It's a righteous anger, and it's a holy anger, and it's the anger of the prophets. And it's not an easy road to be a prophet. You're always, in this liminal space in the church, but it's important. And, we may not get the hierarchy to move forward, but we can keep moving forward in the spaces that we can. And if you do, you are the hope. And I find this meeting and this whole week's group of programming very, very hopeful. So I thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie and Zack. Righteous, prophetic, holy anger. It's a good place to move forward. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We just can't thank the three of you enough for helping to facilitate this conversation and for doing it so honestly and graciously and being so giving of your time. So, I mean, truly, thank you. Kate, any parting words?
Just echoing the gratitude. And this is a very challenging time. I found my own faith life really doing a bit of a roller coaster, and what church exactly am I associated with here? But knowing that we're in this together gives me a lot more hope. Yeah. So thank you for joining us and pushing us, and let's keep going.
Thank you, of course, to all of you who joined us and have stuck with us to this point in the conversation, participants who have registered, and those of you who are watching this video recorded. Please, again, share this, comment, continue the conversation with us, and we'll do our part as well. And we hope you can join us for another summer series conversation soon. So thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.